today. My name is Saida Hassan, and I cover mental health at KERA News, the NPR station here in Dallas, Texas. I'm joined today by two great panelists to talk about storytelling during the coronavirus pandemic. Cynthia Coons is a writer based in New York who writes features for Bloomberg News and Business Week. She's written long-form stories on the women's libido pill, the security apparatus that protects Botox, and the development of a drug to treat suicidal thinking. Cynthia covered the pharmaceutical industry for Bloomberg for 6 years, and prior to this, she was a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and a Heard on the Street columnist. Cynthia has won front page awards for her beat reporting, magazine feature writing, and medical writing, as well as honors from the Association of Healthcare Journalists and National Press Club. Also with us is Anna Kutzman, a staff science writer at the Dallas Morning News and a contributing editor at the Scientific American. Previously, Anna spent 14 years as a reporter, writer, and editor at Newsweek magazine. Her work has been recognized by the National Association of Science Writers, the Society for Features Journalism, and the American Geophysical Union, and is included in the 2018 volume of the Best American Newspaper Narratives. Anna is co-author of Shaky Ground, the untold story of the largest earthquake surge in modern history, about earthquakes linked to oil and gas production. Anna and Cynthia, thank you both so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So let me start by asking each of you, before we get into our conversation about storytelling, just how are you holding up after an especially busy couple of news weeks? And are you finding ways to take breaks and sort of step away from this endless news cycle?
Well, I wouldn't say I'm taking many breaks right now, today, but I feel as though some of the pandemic coping skills actually were really working by the time the summer came along. Some of the things we learned about balancing work and children and home and everything kind of blending together. And I felt as though I had a really good rhythm going this summer, and it was interesting to kind of watch it go off the rails in the beginning of the fall. And I don't know for sure if I'm going to be able to recapture that, what I had over the summer, but it's interesting because we had been through this period already, and we had the acute crisis and then sort of the figuring out how to manage it point, which is I guess what the summer really represented for me. I know that I'm able to grab back some of those skills. So even last night I was about to lay down, and I guess I read the term doom scrolling, and I hadn't heard that before, and it was just perfect for what I was about to do. And I consciously put my phone down and picked up a book instead. And I wouldn't have necessarily gone to do that in May, but because I had sort of figured out what was working for me over the summer, I was able to pull it back in. So I think this is really going to be an ebb and flow. I don't think it's a continuous process towards being able to manage the stress and the constant barrage of both news and sort of this enmeshed home life work situation we're all balancing at this point. But I will say that maybe just saying, okay, I'm going to take back 10% of my skills from the summer of maybe doing yoga once a week, maybe not 3 times a week or something, to try to get some of it back will be the way to get into the, fall and winter and not fall into some bad patterns. But the news cycle is just relentless right now. So I guess that's just the nature of the jobs we do and some of what we're going to have to adapt to.
Absolutely. Anna, what about you?
Yeah, I'm feeling like I'm coping much better now than at the very beginning. At the very beginning, it was just a lot of unknowns. But once I figured out who my sort of go-to reliable sources are in terms of local doctors, local public health experts, experts to follow on Twitter for good story ideas and reliable insights into what's happening, kind of the disease models locally and nationally that I trusted the most. Sort of once I had the sources laid out and I had kind of learned enough, or more than before, about the novel virus and the therapies that were in the pipeline. So that kind of gave me a good baseline to work off of. In terms of time management, I actually like the fact that I'm working at home with my husband and with my daughter. I have a 9th grader who's doing remote only schooling. So, during our breaks, we all meet in the kitchen, we have lunch together, we have dinner together. It's kind of nice. It's kind of a novelty to be able to interact with my whole family during the workday. And I like that. And the other benefit of remote work is that I was able to drive. So I live in Dallas, but my parents and my in-laws live in Massachusetts and New York City. So we actually took a month and a half and worked remotely from the Northeast, which was also really great to be able to kind of get out of my quarantine bubble and have a change of scene. So so it's not been as bad as it otherwise could be. And I feel like I have a store of energy for whatever might come this fall and winter.
Well, that's a great spot to be in. I think you both get at the fact that we've all sort of gained new skills and new coping mechanisms that have served us well in times like this where the news cycle just doesn't seem to let up. I'd like to ask you a bit about how the switch to largely remote work for many of us journalists and storytellers, as well as many of our sources, has affected your reporting and your writing. I know for myself, especially working in a broadcast medium, oftentimes meeting with sources in person and being on the scene for an interview is such a crucial part of capturing a story. And Cynthia, perhaps we can start with you. How has that switch to remote work affected your reporting? Are you still meeting with sources in person?
I have done some in-person reporting, but very minimal comparatively. I have done some in-person. I had to go to a site and I was able to pull it off, but it was actually a little bit hairy because the site was out of state and it was on our quarantine list. And so I was really nervous about, and then I just decided that I would have to, my kids actually do have in-person school right now, so I would probably have to not send them. I mean, I knew if it was on the quarantine list, I just had to come to terms with they wouldn't be able to go for this period of time. And then that state fell off the quarantine list, so that worked out. I could drive, and it wasn't as, I would have been probably a little more nervous about flying, and I didn't want to stay overnight, so I was able to kind of pull that off. Some sources and I have talked about meeting socially distant, but it's not necessary for our relationships necessarily. So I haven't had anyone yet who needs to meet in person say it's a situation where it's so discreet, you would have to do it that way. I will say I actually am feeling more frustrated about that part of the job now than I had been earlier, because I feel as though early on, it was so novel to be stuck at home, and I'd already worked from home, and to a large extent, a lot of our reporting had gone into this talking on the phone component, but I still like to do a lot of my reporting, especially for feature writing, in person. And I will say that I am hitting a point now where I really do I need to be able to knock on certain people's doors, or there was a story I was working on where I needed to talk to multiple people in the community, and it was just so many extra phone calls to get people on the phone, whereas if I could just go, it just would have been simpler. And I guess I'm just longing for what feels like an easier time. But I do feel as though for our field, we can't really stay out of the world as long as maybe we anticipated. Sure, we're tech enabled, and sure, we can talk to, say, doctors and things like that. We don't have to go into places that are dangerous. But I am feeling as though now some of the storytelling I'm really enjoying reading, I can tell that people are there. And I think I'm sort of seeing it as, yeah, I kind of need to get out more within reason. But I have not found it impossible by any means to get people on the phone and to do the work. I just don't feel like we can go on like this for another 6 months or another year and effectively tell the stories we need to tell.
Anna, how about you?
Yeah, I just finished a long feature about a COVID-19 survivor and kind of his recovery over the last 6 months. And so normally that's a story where I would do a lot of that fly on the wall reporting, hang out at his house, kind of watch his gradual improvement, watch him exercise, watch him interact with his family, go with him to walk his dogs. And I kind of thought about whether to take that risk. And I just didn't feel totally comfortable, because CDC guidance is still not to kind of hang out in indoor spaces with other people. So I chose to sort of do more we met in person outdoors at their dining table, kind of in their yard, kind of for a series of interviews over several weeks. And I was able to see them in person, but I wasn't really able to kind of see them in action. But what I did was I actually partnered with my photographer. So our photographers have excellent PPE, and it's, and it's part of their job to spend a lot of good FaceTime, in-person time with sources. So my photographer felt more comfortable going into the house. So he kind of went into their house, spent time with them, and then we were able to have a conversation about, hey, what did you observe? What did you see in their house? And he learned a lot of things that I otherwise wouldn't have learned. And so I was able to ask my sources about that. So it's definitely imperfect, but I think maybe as time goes on and we learn more about how the virus is transmitted, learn more about how to protect ourselves, that kind of in-person fly on the wall reporting might improve. Yeah, but otherwise I'm doing outdoor interviews, partnering with photographers are kind of two good ways that I've found to go about it.
Absolutely. Well,
one other thing I was going to say I did for a story, and I would love to do more of if I'm not able to go places, was I convinced someone to give me a drive around on FaceTime. And it took many hours, which was fine. It was a lot. It was really generous of them to do it, because actually it would have been a half hour sort of thing otherwise, but it took many hours. And we would drive places, and they would go outside and they would walk around and they would show me things, and I was, oh, what's on the left, what's on the right. Like you said, Anna, it's imperfect. It's not the same thing as seeing it or smelling it or knowing what it feels like or sounds like, but it was one technique to use the technology we have, and I would certainly do more of that as it's available. Though I will say, when I did some in-person reporting recently, it just brought back memories of how much easier it is to be in the room, even if it's just a couple minutes. So, but it's another way you might be able to use your phone to see and build imagery for a story.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I have just one other thing to add is I'd never taken advantage of video calls, or very rarely before, Zoom and Skype. And now it's kind of added this like third way of reporting a story that I hadn't really thought about before. So, typically I'll do a lot of informational interviews with scientists over the phone, and I don't ordinarily need to see them. But now I'm doing more of those informational calls over Zoom, and it adds a really kind of nice personal dimension to actually see the source and kind of, interact with them on video. I think it makes for good reporter source relationships, kind of deeper relationships and better bonds and more trust.
That's a great point, Anna. I think it's certainly, we've all sort of gotten a crash course in Zoom and all of these different communication platforms too. And so I can totally relate to what both of you have shared. And I think that it's been somewhat easier to connect with certain sources that it may have taken more time to schedule out, a time to meet in person or sit down and talk over the phone. And I did also feel, kind of at the beginning of the pandemic, especially, that, it's not ideal to have to share Zoom audio or phone audio, but it is kind of true to life, to the experience that we're all living right now, including our audiences. And Anna, I would love to talk a bit more about the Michael Hoffman story. I believe that's the story you were referring to, of the COVID survivor here in the Dallas area, who spent, as you reported, spent 30 days on a ventilator this past spring and is still recovering from some of those COVID-19 complications. I'd love to talk more about your reporting process, because you painted such an intimate portrait of Michael, I think, as a person, as a father, his physical symptoms, as well as the emotional challenges of this really lengthy recovery process. Can you tell us how you connected with him and how that story came to be?
Sure. Yeah. Actually, this was the second story that I wrote about him. I first met his wife in April. I was looking to do a story on convalescent plasma. So I'm really interested in the history of medicine, some of these, kind of historical approaches that come back during times of crisis. And so I wanted to tell the history of convalescent plasma. But I was having trouble finding patient stories. Normally I get these by calling hospitals. So there were a lot of hospitals in the Dallas area that were starting to use convalescent plasma. Of course, convalescent plasma is plasma from patients who have survived COVID-19, which, ideally is rich in antibodies, and those antibodies get infused into people who are sick to help them fight the disease. So normally hospitals, they're proud of their innovations, and they will kind of help get me in touch with patients. But this time, all of our hospitals were overwhelmed. I was hitting dead ends. So I did a search on Facebook for convalescent plasma Dallas. And I had never searched Facebook before in that way, but I struck out on Twitter. And on Facebook, all of a sudden, I found this plea for convalescent plasma from friends of Michael Hoffman. And there were email addresses of, I guess, of two of their friends at the bottom of the plea. The plea had only gone out maybe a week before I had found it. So I wrote to their friends, kind of tried to sort of phrase it very gently, like, I'm a science reporter at the Dallas Morning News. I'm working on a story about the science and history of convalescent plasma. You know, I'm sorry to hear, you know, that your friend, you know, is sick with COVID-19. But, you know, if, you know, I would just be really interested in, you know, connecting with him or with his relatives to see if they would like to sort of tell their story. So that night I got a call back from his wife, which I wasn't expecting. And she told me that her husband had been on a ventilator for 3 weeks at that point. He had just gotten plasma a couple of days ago, and his doctors felt like he was turning a corner. So I sort of happened to get her at this kind of hopeful time when things were slowly starting to turn around. At that point, she wasn't ready to talk. She wanted to make sure that her husband was doing better, was more on solid footing. So I waited, and I didn't know if she would call me back or not, but she did. A week later, she called me back, and we told kind of the first part of his story, which is that the doctors that saved him actually turned out to be the same team of doctors who had treated our Ebola patients in Dallas. So the patient who had arrived from Africa with Ebola, and then 2 nurses who contracted Ebola in the hospital while caring for him. They'd used convalescent plasma on their Ebola patients. They were already familiar with it. You know, they infused it into Michael, and he did start to do better. We'll never know probably why, whether it was convalescent plasma or remdesivir or myriad other treatments. But anyway, that was sort of the first installment of telling his story. And then I wanted to kind of come back and follow up and see how his recovery was going for the second story.
And you noted in this second story that when the DMN originally reported on Michael's story, at the time he wanted to keep his identity somewhat private and didn't want to share his last name. What compelled him to open up for this second story?
So I think the first time it was his wife. I was only talking to his wife. He wasn't yet able to speak really because he'd just come off the ventilator. His voice was hoarse. So I think his wife was being protective of him. She didn't have his full consent to give his name. So she wanted to give him privacy. But I think what compelled them to go forward the first time and also this time is they felt incredibly grateful to the medical team that had saved Michael. And they wanted to kind of to give them credit in these stories. But also, I think Michael wanted to inform other people about the importance of taking COVID-19 seriously, of protecting yourself, of staying safe, and also that if you do get very sick from it, there's a way forward, a path forward, and there's a way, you know, you can recover. There's hope for recovery for even those who are most gravely ill.
Well, I'll open this next question up to each of you, and Cynthia, I'd love to start with you. How important and impactful is it to share stories like these, you know, the lived experience of folks who have either contracted COVID-19 or had a close brush with it in their life, perhaps their loved ones? Has that been important to your storytelling during this time? And do you find generally that people are open and willing to share, or has it been a challenge to kind of find those voices of everyday people?
I've had a similar experience to what Anna was describing in terms of finding people who are willing to talk, but who are a bit nervous about giving their name and their sort of journey of changing their mind and kind of opening up. I think where we were at in April and May and June, maybe even, there was a lot of stigma around even being a COVID patient. And I think people were really nervous about being identified. And I noticed this in other people's stories as well, as found it very hard to get people to talk on the record then. Whereas now I don't find it as big of a challenge. I think people are more comfortable with sharing their experience. I mean, there's so much randomness to this virus that I don't think people feel as much. Although I almost wonder if we're turning a different kind of corner now, because there's a lot of, at least around, like I'm in New Jersey, and in the Northeast, we've lived with probably more restrictions than much of the country. And so now when someone gets COVID, at least in the community, there's a lot of questions around what activities people are engaging in. So I think we might also be entering a new zone of people being a little more reluctant to share. I could see that happening going into the fall and winter now, because there's so much pressure to not engage in certain activities that may even be permitted, and this question about indoor exposure. But I would say that people who suffered in, especially people who got COVID in the spring, now I found it's not as challenging to get people to share their stories. But I have experienced what Anna's describing, and I leave it up to the person. I definitely think talking to someone 4 or 5 times, generally if you talk to them a number of times, they are going to be more willing to participate because they get less and less afraid of what you're proposing. I think having a phone call with someone and them saying they don't want to participate doesn't mean it's over, but I wouldn't recommend pushing on that subject. It's just you're talking to them more and continue to talk to them and follow their journey a little more. And as a reporter, maybe I would say you do kind of just want to stick around, because people do change their minds, particularly they have in this scenario. But it is interesting. In the beginning, I think some of the stigma was somewhat like, I've also covered mental health in the past, like you, and that can be harder. That can be harder, actually. There were times when I just thought there was no way I would get someone who would tell me about their mental health experience in the workplace. I literally thought that was an impossibility. And that was much harder than, say, getting someone to talk about their COVID journey now. But April and May was kind of similar. The stigma was similar. So I think we're gonna, ebb and flow. But I think it's critical to share these stories for the same reason that Anna said, that people need to hear it and that it's real, and we're combating a situation where our own politicians are calling into question how serious COVID is. So I think sharing people's stories is like the one way to continue to have a narrative that shows that there are many faces of COVID.
Absolutely. And Anna, I know that you have reported on this story from a number of different angles, the public health perspective, and then also these much more in-depth personal portraits. Have you found, beyond the Michael Hoffman story, how easy or difficult has it been to find people, characters to help drive these stories that you tell?
Let's see. So outside of the Michael Hoffman story, I haven't done too many patient stories. Generally, my reporting focuses on research, medical research and scientific research. So I have found it, pretty easy to find, doctors and researchers to kind of use as key personalities in my stories. Although that also has been a little bit harder than usual. I find that hospitals are, especially some of our public hospitals locally, have made it a lot more difficult to access their experts for one reason or another. And I don't know why that is. I think my guess is that it's because of the politics around this virus. So our public hospitals get state funding. They don't want to say the wrong thing, be accused of fear mongering, or I just feel like everybody's being very, very careful. So I've often had to reach out to doctors in Houston or doctors, public health experts outside of Dallas, outside of Texas even sometimes, to get sort of good reporting.
Absolutely. Well, I think, Cynthia, your comparison to mental health reporting feels really spot on to me, because I often tell my sources that it is so much easier for me to find an expert, a researcher, a provider to talk to than to find someone who's willing to go on the record that has a really specific lived experience, and oftentimes takes more time and patience and legwork, but is so rewarding when you can add that element to the story.
Yeah, and you don't want to pressure anyone. I think that's the other common theme here, is that you don't want to put someone in a situation that they don't feel good about. So there are people I've talked to for quite a bit of time, and I've sort of realized that, or they've even changed their mind. And sometimes I've spent hours talking to them, and I continue to talk to them even though they're not really going to be in the story anymore. But it's just really tough, because this isn't a situation, whereas when you deal with government officials or any people inside companies, or you could pressure someone to say, you need this to go on the record. There's a certain technique you can kind of sort of impart why, and it's in their job capacity to maybe share that information. But these are people, it's their personal life. And I was surprised at the outset that COVID was this stigmatized. I was surprised that April, May kind of time period, it was kind of like, you don't say that you had a diagnosis, or people were very anonymized about it. I did not expect that. It's a virus. I just thought it was going to be, oh, I had the flu. I just didn't realize. I think people were very nervous about who they'd been around and who they've been exposed to and where they'd been. And I don't know, it was surprising to run into the same level of stigma.
Absolutely. Well, I think that there have been so many sort of different threads that we can follow from, of course, the broader COVID-19 story, but some of the tangential health effects or societal effects that we've seen in terms of, of course, we've seen just a surge in the number of Americans reporting symptoms of mental illnesses like depression and anxiety, and, lots of experts sort of raising the flag about an impending potential mental health crisis as we continue these social distancing measures and isolation. And I'd love to know, Cynthia, if you or Anna have sort of been following these other health outcomes. There's enough to keep pace with, of course, just from a COVID public health perspective, but has your reporting touched on mental health and sort of other social issues as well?
Mine definitely has. I did most of last year write about mental health. That was predominantly what I covered in 2019. So when COVID started, I was on a different reporting line, but jumped back into mental health because there was so much demand for kind of parsing what was going on. One of the struggles in this mental health space, though, is that data is so lags, and so data on things like addiction and reports of suicidal ideation or treatment for depression, it's always years behind. So we're relying on other sort of ad hoc data sources, demand for virtual therapy or things of that nature to tell the story. And I just worry that that doesn't tell the whole story, or that captures a small part of it. And I think there's going to be, like you said, a lot to cover moving on from here, even from this point forward. And so it was just a system, the mental health system was in crisis, and COVID could just push it over the edge, not giving people access to the kinds of therapeutic interventions that they needed. So I think there will be a lot more there. I just wish there was a way to get consistent data. And so that's been the biggest challenge, is finding the numbers that really represent the here and now. And in the absence of that, getting good enough anecdotes that you feel like you're building a story that is true and authentic to what's going on right now.
Anna, has your reporting touched on some of those mental health or social issues as well?
A little bit. My colleagues have been writing about the impact of COVID-19 and the lockdown on domestic violence. Domestic violence rates in our area have spiked. We've started doing a series of conference calls for readers with experts. So I did a Q&A with a psychiatrist who predicted, big wave of mental illness, kind of a parallel mental health pandemic, and connected to the COVID-19 pandemic, and offered advice on symptoms to watch for, how to take care of your mental health, how to take care of your friends and family. And I guess we've also looked a great deal at the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on different ethnic communities in Dallas. So one of the stories that I did, we looked to see what our hardest hit zip code is in the Dallas area. So the zip code with by far the highest infection rate and one of the highest per capita infection rates is a predominantly Latino zip code. And so we did kind of an in-depth story on that zip code. And the reason is, the reasons for this are well known. It's just because it's a working class neighborhood with a lot of essential workers who worked at businesses that weren't taking the best precautions and preventive measures. People who have to interact with others on a daily basis, and of course the lack of access to healthcare in some of these immigrant neighborhoods. So we've done some of that reporting too.
I think that what you mentioned, the conversation with the mental health expert, I think that formats like that can feel like such a great community service at a time like this, to really allow people to get that information in real time and be able to pose questions to the experts instead of us reporters sort of being the middleman. Have either of you found yourself getting more creative with those types of storytelling formats, whether it's conversations on social media or, sort of these virtual engagement events that we find ourselves doing? Has that been a part of your reporting during this time?
We did something similar with a couple of psychiatrists addressing mental health and COVID quite early on in April. Actually, now you're making me think we should do it again, because that seems like a lifetime ago in terms of what we were trying to understand about what we were experiencing. But I tend to think you're right. We should be revisiting that concept of the role media can play as kind of a public service, because I think in some ways we've moved into this idea of like objectivity to such an extreme that we could consider this, some of these roles we're playing as being able to convey information. I mean, mental health is so particularly important because so many people can't access in-network care. And so there was a rush in the very beginning for insurers to create access for some of these telehealth platforms, but those were always temporary stopgaps. I doubt that is still in place. Some of it may still be in place, but I think now we are hitting the more real part of the crisis where the tools are just not available to people. So you're right, that's a great way of putting it, as the public service part of our job. So yeah, we have done a little bit of that. And I've done panels and things of that nature, but this is, this isn't a dialogue that should have been restricted to the beginning of the pandemic, because I think, as we said at the outset, there's just waves of this and it's just kind of relentless.
Yeah, we've also done kind of Zoom interviews that we've posted online with experts, and we've partnered with our local NBC station, NBC5, to do live stream panel conversations where readers can tweet us, text us, and email us questions in real time to pose to the experts. I'm often aware of the fact that we're in a period where the general public doesn't always trust journalists. They, if you look at polls, people trust scientists and doctors more than they trust journalists. So I've thought about putting the public and scientists kind of together directly to kind of impact, public understanding of COVID-19 and treatments and things like that. We also had, before the pandemic, the Dallas Morning News had a pretty rich events program. And one of these events was a science festival that I'd helped start a couple of years ago, where we partner with several scientific institutions and bring the general public into research labs to meet face-to-face with scientists and kind of hear about all the scientific research that's going on in the DFW area. So this fall, we're doing a virtual version of that, kind of a series of virtual lab visits with scientists for the general public. And some of these will be related to COVID-19, but others will be, unrelated to COVID-19, about black holes and fossils and dinosaurs and things like that. So I think, the pandemic has kind of given us a good opportunity to explore other ways of reaching our audience and interacting with our readers.
That's great. Well, speaking about distrust that many of us are contending with in the news business, Cynthia, I know that you recently reported on the prevalence of Americans who believe in conspiracy theories. And I think that that's, of course, another challenge to contend with, from a public health and messaging perspective. Can you tell us what you learned about how those beliefs might be shaping people's behavior and response to the pandemic?
Unfortunately, it's exactly what you would think. The higher a person's sort of threshold is for believing conspiracy theories, the more likely they are, or the less likely they are to be wearing masks in a 24-hour period. So this disinformation is very squarely associated with not following public health recommendations. And I mean, it's a really tough issue to parse, because even our own public health recommendations, there have been times when the CDC's dialed back or changed recommendations in such short order that I think people trying to follow don't even know who to follow, or what to follow. So it's really a strange time we're in that it's not like you can point to, okay, this is exactly what you need to follow when. I mean, yes, the CDC is that, but then there's these questions about some of their own changing guidelines. So And then you've had people inside the government who've expressed conspiracy theories in online, who've had to take leave from their jobs because that is, disconcerting to say the least. So it's a really fine line to walk in terms of how do we cover disinformation and not sound as though we're feeding the fight that Anna's pointing out, this distrust in media is what's driving that. So it doesn't have to be binary, right? You don't have to trust the media to not believe conspiracy theories. I guess it's sort of like, how do we portray and relay in a message from say public health authorities without engaging in the war that's going on, because this is a war over whether or not the media is telling the truth, right? At the end of the day, it is kind of, we are really in the center of it, whether we believe ourselves to be or not. It's really about, oh, I'm going to trust these conspiracies because the newspapers are making things up, or they're a tool for some sort of deep state agenda. So I don't know the answer to this. I certainly found out it was quite as obvious as I just thought. Everything's always a little more complicated than you think. When you start to dig into it, there's always nuance, but this is pretty fairly black and white in terms of believing in conspiracy theories and not necessarily and engaging in behaviors that might be considered riskier. So I think we need to find our way, and that's going to be a little bit, organization by organization. How does the media sort of reestablish its own credibility and pass on the message of the public health authorities? I think it's going to be an iterative process, and I think things are going to shift even as the year goes on. But it's very scary to realize that disinformation is a lot more than people maybe sitting at home thinking one thing, but it really translates into actions that have consequences for all of us.
Absolutely. Well, I think another sort of case study on public perception has been the attitudes around a potential vaccine for COVID-19 and whether folks would be open to being vaccinated, how trustworthy they are. And Cynthia, I know that you have covered sort of the race for a vaccine. Tell us about the threads that you're following on that story, and what people should know about where that's.
I think the most important thing that I can take away from, I've covered pharmaceutical companies, and this is really a story about these companies. They are not acting differently than they would normally. And that's the thing I try to impart to everyone, at least that I talk to and sort of engage with, that this isn't a bunch of companies like racing to play a political game. They want these to be safe. They want them to be effective, and they don't want to take any shortcuts or risks that they can't justify. They know their role, right? So where the vaccine becomes quite political, and this is becoming a problem for, again, coming back to this trust issue, the companies themselves are, as far as I can tell, operating as they would with any other vaccine process, obviously much, much quicker. That goes without saying, because if we waited 10 years for a vaccine, I don't know even how that would work. So I do think that it's interesting, because I think the companies are stuck. I also think the companies are having trouble with their own position in this whole political situation. And we've seen companies, try to communicate that they're not playing politics here. But it's become a different sort of relationship with the government than I think they've ever had in the past. I mean, the companies' relationships with the FDA have been like, they hand over the data and the FDA assesses it and they wait to see what happens. And now they're working in real time in concert with the government. And so there's a lot that's happening that's shifting their own relationships. But I guess the thing is, I tend to cover this from a business point of view, and I really don't think that the basics have changed, and that the companies know what they need to do to make sure something is safe. Obviously, compressed timeframes change that dynamic, but they're not operating recklessly. And so that's tricky, because there's some people who don't agree with this idea that we can do this quickly based on this idea that is maybe propaganda, but that's also what the scientists are trying to accomplish. And they have accomplished some of these things quickly, in the sense that they could, build a quicker flu vaccine if a new strain emerges. So that's a really interesting thread to walk into, because the disinformation is on all sides. And but I really do think the companies aren't going to roll something out that's risky or dangerous. I mean, that's my personal belief. But I mean, we're so close to knowing, right? This is potentially coming quite soon. But I would say that that's the one thing I tend to believe is that, and I'm sure Anna has a perspective on talking to the scientists and public health researchers that she knows in Texas, but I don't think that anyone who's really in this world, in infectious disease, in vaccine development, in epidemiology, is trying to take shortcuts. I really don't think they are. I think everyone knows what the enormity of the task is and what it's going to take to have something that's safe. I think one thing people maybe don't understand is the difference between safe and maybe effective. I think there's a chance that, I think the companies are very concerned about safety, obviously. I don't know if the first vaccines are going to be the most effective. Maybe the more effective ones are going to come later. And that's, we'll continue to be vaccinated for coronavirus, maybe like we are with boosters for other illnesses. But that's the message I think the government really has to impart. I think that is on the government. The onus is on the government to impart that. I don't think as the media we can make sense of that for people, but we obviously need things to finish trials before we get to that point.
Absolutely. Well, it strikes me that you both have covered so many different aspects of this COVID-19 story that has sort of become an underpinning, I feel, to virtually every story that we tell in 2020, whether it is directly tied to COVID or not, whether we're talking about the elections or ongoing protests against police violence that we continue to see here in the Dallas area and beyond. And so sort of taking a step back a little bit, if you could talk about how your newsrooms and your teams have approached sort of delegating and dividing the work. I think that we have all learned very quickly that this was too big of a story for just one health reporter in a newsroom to follow. And I think that, everybody has sort of pitched in and taken on different pieces of this puzzle. Anna, do you have any thoughts to share on kind of what stories you have really taken the lead on versus others that, that you might delegate or that others in your newsroom may jump on?
So I'll say, absolutely. Every reporter in the newsroom, whether they're a sports reporter or a cops reporter or an education reporter, has covered COVID-19 in some way. And in fact, in the spring, when there were no sports, all of our sports reporters were covering COVID-19. And we've sort of worked out a system. So the stories that I tend to cover or have input on are the ones that are more scientifically rigorous. How does an mRNA vaccine work? What are the treatments that are in the pipeline? What do and don't we know about how COVID-19 is transmitted? What do the models say? So we have two science reporters, basically me and another person who are specifically trained in science reporting. So we field questions from the rest of the newsroom, and we sort of, give our input and point, business reporters and sports reporters to good studies and good experts for them to talk to. I guess that answers your question.
Absolutely. Cynthia, do you have any thoughts to add along those lines about how you choose what to cover and what to maybe delegate?
Yeah, this is an interesting time, I think, as a reporter in that. So I cover business and for a while, and there have been times where I've covered maybe more finance or things that are more, even the business of healthcare wasn't on everyone's minds. But even right now, I feel that even the conversations I have with friends outside of the media world really help inform what people are interested in knowing more about in a way that wasn't normally the case. Definitely, I wasn't writing about stories that were what everyone was talking about. And I remember when this first started, and I have a 3 and a 5-year-old, and they were at home and they were just crawling all over me, and I was trying to work, and it was just the silliest scene, and everyone knows it who has kids at home or pets or whatever. It was quite a lot. And I decided to just do a story right out of the gate about having the world's most distracting coworkers. Just kind of not even meant to be a joke about it, but this idea that we're suddenly thrown into this world where these multitude of factors are screaming in our face. And it was, that was a fun story based on just genuinely conversations I was having with everyone I knew. And from there have been other conversations where I've come to realize, wow, what people really, this is maybe where there are places where we can play as a news organization that are really where people's heads are at, because people are demanding content now. And that's actually been a really interesting development. I've been able to share the work I do or my colleagues do with so many more people because the demand is there. So I've actually found that's an interesting way to, not discount the conversations you have for kind of getting your head around this idea that maybe what people are concerned about when you hear them talking is whether or not a vaccine is safe. Oh, maybe that's what you should be focused on. Or this is kind of an interesting time, whereas normally we wouldn't be this, I think, tethered to the public. But my organization has a lot of different segmentation. So we do have teams working on, say, diversity stories or topics related, maybe equality, or focused very much on when the Black Lives Matter protest was happening, like how that is impacted by business. There are people doing that. But we also, as a news organization, do kind of all jump in and flex in on different stories. And very similar to what Anna was describing, everyone was writing about COVID, people have been writing about race, people have been writing about a lot of topics that aren't necessarily like classically the lane they might be sitting in. And I think the great thing about the way our newsroom has handled it has been, it seems to be a very go try it kind of attitude, because I actually think the demand for content is so high right now that there's not much to lose. I mean, it's just the internet. You put out a story, see what happens. Sometimes it blows up, sometimes no one reads it, like do the next one. So I don't know, that's what I tell reporters who are trying to figure out what to do, or what I know. I have conversations with colleagues when they're asking when should they do stories, and I just say do it tomorrow. Just do it. Just get it out there and get on to the next thing, because you just like really cannot predict where we're going to be in the news cycle when your story hits. So that's been my sort of approach to this.
Absolutely. Well, we are getting close to our time, but I have one last question to close us out with. And I think, Cynthia, you segued us really nicely into this kind of closing thought. But as our audiences are so overloaded with news and maybe have this endless appetite for stories, it sounds like, what elements do you think really make for a compelling and standout story in this age that we are living in, where there is this really endless news cycle and maybe endless content to choose from? Cynthia, any thoughts on that?
I would say don't be afraid to take a risk and go where your thinking takes you. And it doesn't have to be where the tide is going necessarily. I think there's a lot of reporting going on, and it looks like a lot of other reporting, and there's a lot of similar stuff happening where we're doing a lot of the same stories. And there's an element to that. It's a very heavy news cycle and everyone has to stay on top of it. But I think the things that have really stood out to me are, well, some story, it comes back to the original question. The stories that have really captured me in the last couple of weeks are when I could feel and see and smell the story. I know the person has been there, which drives my desire to kind of get back into the world, even though obviously we need to wait and do that in a very safe and measured manner. But besides that sort of component of it, which we've discussed, we can sort of use other techniques to recreate. I think I think now is a good time to take risks and a good time to follow leads. And I can think back to conversations I had with people early on about, wait, is COVID disproportionately hitting people of color? And we didn't know that. I mean, really, if you think back to March at the very beginning, we didn't know that. Now it's indisputable, but you can kind of go out early on some of these subject matters. And in August, I was thinking, is COVID going to really decimate the workforce, the female workforce, because so many people's kids are at home? And now you're seeing the numbers, it's happening. So I think if you have a hunch, follow it, because these things, and even if they don't stand out the minute you write them, they will stand out later. So I think there is a sort of trust your gut and be comfortable. Maybe not necessarily, you don't have to go against the grain, but you can make a slight left or a slight right, and take a chance on a theme that you're exploring, because I think there is a high demand for content, and the things that stand out are going to be things that make you think differently. And that's our job too, not just to report the news, because there is a kind of a, you can get a bit comfortable when it's a heavy news cycle to just continue reporting the news, but to take a second and think about a different way of looking at it and just run with it. I think that's what really will stand out at the end of the year when we all look back at this enormity of coverage that we've put out in 2020.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I wish I knew, what made for the most compelling story. I mean, to me, every aspect of the COVID-19 pandemic is fascinating and gripping, and I just can't get enough. But it's been hard for me to predict, which stories our readers are going to find the most engaging, that will draw the most readers for the longest amount of time. I guess for me, it would just be the very local version of this, international story. So we read about the most promising vaccines. Well, which ones are in trials, in the Dallas area? How can you sign up for these clinical trials if you're interested? What is a clinical trial? What do our local doctors say about these vaccines and their promise? You read about remdesivir and monoclonal antibodies and steroids. Well, how are our local hospitals implementing these? And, what have been patient outcomes here? And how have these, impacted local mortality rates? The question of how long, has COVID-19 been circulating in the United States? Where did it come from? What areas did it hit first? Well, for our purposes, we would want to know, when did it come to Texas? When did it come to Dallas? Where did it come from? How did it spread through the community? All these very local versions of this big international story are, I think, what serves our readers best. And so that's what we as a team try to do.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to our panelists, Cynthia Coons and Anna Kutzman, for joining us for this conversation on storytelling during a truly extraordinary time. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us today. And if you have questions, please feel free to type them into the chat and we'll do our best to get to them. Thank you all for being with us today, and stay safe.